Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new A Quiet Place movie, A Quiet Place Day One. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So the original A Quiet Place movie, which hit theaters way back in 2018, quickly became a kind of surprising breakout smash hit. Personally, I loved it. That ended up being, I think, my favorite movie of the year. And even a bit of trivia, that was the first movie that we ever did a review here, for here at the Collision. I think that for me and like a lot of people, that movie thrilled audiences because of its kind of ingenious storytelling approach of the monsters that kind of hunts based on sound and the very limited dialogue. But I think even more than that was just the way that director John Krasinski had kind of his impressive ability to maintain like very compelling emotional drama at the center of all the monster induced horror. And the sequel, which followed Quiet Place Part 2, which came out in 2020, very much followed suit and was a hit both with audiences as well as kind of being critically acclaimed. And now, with a different director as well as a whole new cast of characters, A Quiet Place Day One is transporting audiences way back in time to the onset of the alien invasion. And I had high hopes for this movie. This is one of my most anticipated movies of the year, although I was somewhat hesitant as to how far can you stretch this concept, this premise. How many stories can you tell based on this? But I am happy to say that this movie is good. I enjoyed this movie quite a bit. I don't think it reinvents the wheel in any way, although I do think with kind of a new immersive, setting it in an urban environment, as well as some very compelling, acting performances and a meaningful human story kind of amid all the horrors and thrills, this film does prove that there is plenty of road left for the franchise. And just in general, prequels are notoriously difficult to get right. Just last month, Furiosa, which was a prequel to a very critically acclaimed Mad Max Fury Road, arrived and just became a big box office failure, did not spark a lot of interest. But I think Day One is able to successfully kind of ride that delicate line of retaining enough familiar elements from those original films while also just infusing enough kind of fresh ideas into that established template. Because whereas both the first two movies were set in very isolated rural areas, Day One takes place right in New York City, and I think the urban environment does provide just an intriguing, a new aesthetic that allows this film to differentiate itself from the other two entries in the series. Although despite moving, the story into a very busy city, this movie also takes a cue from its predecessors by zooming in to the characters' kind of personal journeys rather than kind of getting lost in just the potential for, big mass spectacle. Because when it comes to this genre of kind of horror monster movies, typically there are two different kind of varieties of those. The first, in which the audiences typically root for the monster to claim more victims, often in very bloody and grotesque ways. And then there's the other kind of variety in which viewers are cheering for the humans to persevere and survive. And I think a lot of Christians that maybe can feel uneasy about this genre of films typically have that first sort of variety in mind. But what has always elevated this series sort of above the fray of many of the other genre films is that they do commit to that second variety and do show restraint towards this desensitizing violence, despite the fact that there is violent alien carnage happening throughout the story. The Quiet Place Day One, as well as the first two films, really kind of fundamentally at their core affirm just the value of life. This is a movie where you're cheering for the protagonist. I think it succeeds in doing that in this film in large part just due to the strength of its very easy to root for characters. Because anyone worried that kind of the loss of John Krasinski and Emily Blunt, who starred in the first couple movies, that might derail the series, can breathe easily, because both Lupita Nyong'o and Joseph Quinn of Stranger Things fame are great in the lead role. They have kind of enough charisma and chemistry with each other, despite the fact that obviously neither of them are able to have a whole lot of dialogue. And in many ways, this movie is almost like a compelling human drama, just with the backdrop of an alien invasion. I think if you cut out all the alien plot, there is a hypothetical version of this movie that simply works as sort of inspirational emotional drama. Unfortunately, I think the alien invasion component of this film is not quite as effective as the human element. There certainly are moments of kind of entertaining tension, such as like a very edgier seat sequence in a flooded subway station. But I think overall, this film just lacks some of the cleverness of the first two films. New director Michael Sarkonsky, kind of his approach leans more into like frantic chases and action rather than kind of slowly escalating feelings of tension or dread. I think if the original two films took kind of inspiration from horror classics like Ridley Scott's Alien or Steven Spielberg's original Jurassic Park movie, then this prequel is kind of more akin to James Cameron's follow-up Aliens or maybe the later Jurassic World movies. And obviously some of that is this the result that now 3 movies into the series, sort of that fear of the unknown that works so effectively in the earlier movies, it's just hard to achieve now that we have seen the aliens revealed multiple times in full. And I think to compensate for that, Day One relies more on just an expanded scope, kind of attempts to unsettle audiences more by just, like stampedes or just masses of these aliens chasing after the characters rather than more like isolated moments of tension. And I think a lot of these moments, they are exciting and entertaining to watch. They're just a lot less memorable and I think kind of less expertly like choreographed than the originals. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there's really not a whole lot, probably less than you might expect. Language, there are multiple kind of profanities, probably 6 to 8 to 10, I think exclusively of a word beginning with S, and most of those actually happen in the reading of a single poem in the opening scene of this film, but nothing beyond that. Sexuality, there's nothing, as far as sexuality goes in this film. Violence, as expected, many characters are killed by these aliens, but despite having perhaps the biggest death count in the franchise, which is a product of just the more urban populated setting, there is very little violence that is actually shown. You see aliens like pounce on characters or drag them out of screen, and you see at various times you see like kind of dried blood stains on the wall or the road or on cars, but a lot of the actual like act of violence is thankfully left up to viewers' own imagination. There's also one moment of like human on human violence in which a man who is panicking ultimately has his neck snapped in order to keep him quiet and not risk drawing the attention of the aliens. And also should note that there are a few instances of what essentially amounts to suicide of characters who kind of in despair or for other reasons like purposefully make noise in order to attract the creatures. As far as things going on beneath the surface of this, themes, kind of worldviews, messages, I think the beauty of a lot of horror movies is they often depict kind of deeper human experiences. Kind of according to the filmmakers, the first A Quiet Place movie was very much like an extended metaphor for parenting, of seeking to protect our children and equip them to navigate like a hostile world that's ready to pounce and devour them. And kind of in a similar way, kind of beneath the surface of just the alien invasion that's taking place, Day One is at its kind of core I think a meaningful, powerful story about grief and mortality and just embracing the life that you have rather than longing for perhaps the life that you wish you had. Because Sam, who is Lupita Nyong'o's character, she's dying. Her body is like being in the process of being ravaged by, a serious illness, same illness that took the life of her father. And kind of the chaos caused by the alien invasion around her does end up serving as a metaphor for Sam's own like internal emotional state. Because she is like in the movie physically trapped on an island and surrounded by death, but she also just feels like internally very isolated and devoid of joy and wonder. Paradoxically, it is in the middle of this devastating alien invasion that she ultimately learns to find some catharsis and just accept the life that she has. I do think it is interesting too that kind of the turning point of that journey towards more kind of peace and acceptance does begin while the two characters are kind of taking shelter in a church building, and you do see like various like imagery of crosses and things in some of the rubble, although for the most part like outside of some of those just the images or like that religious setting, the film itself doesn't necessarily explore spiritual matters, but I do think as a Christian watching this, Sam's journey kind of echoes the biblical wisdom you find in Ecclesiastes 3:1, where it says, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. And I obviously don't want to spoil the very ending of this movie, but I do suspect that some Christian viewers may have conflicting opinions on the final scene. I think if taken very, on a literal level, it arguably does maybe undercut some of that the movie's positive message. Well, on the other hand, I think if taken more metaphorical as a connection of this deeper theme of just kind of Sam's journey, I do think that the ending is less problematic and does serve a more, I think, powerful fulfillment of the film's ultimate themes. So in the end, I think kind of overall, when compared against the first two movies, A Quiet Place Day One is probably the weakest of the trilogy, although to me, that's more, a testament just to the quality of the first two films rather than, any criticism of this prequel. Because when measured against a lot of just the other horror thriller movies that are released, in recent years, A Quiet Place Day One is a worthy new entry in the series that does keep the franchise, I think, firmly rooted as just one of the best horror series going today. I think the established template of sort of the silent movie storytelling mechanism will eventually grow stale, but that day has not come just yet. But hey, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this movie, if a fan of the franchise, or this is maybe your entry point, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about that. Encourage you guys too, if you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Lots of movie reviews and a podcast and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.